Everyone, please be seated. Thank you all very much for being here. Joining me up here are our Chief Legislative Officer, Chris Schenk, our Deputy Chief of Staff, Tiffany Robinson, Secretary Ellington Churchill of the Department of General Services, and Kiefer Mitchell, who is a Senior Advisor to the Governor. I want to welcome all of the other folks that are joined us here, representatives from the Maryland State Board of Education, as well as representatives from the local boards in Baltimore County, Howard County, Prince George's County, and all of the parents and teachers, and most importantly, right up here in the front row, students from Baltimore City Collegiate School who are joining us this morning. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Along with them is the school's Executive Director, Jack Pinnell. And I want to thank you for being here. I have always believed very strongly that every single child in Maryland deserves access to a great education, regardless of what neighborhood they happen to grow up in. From day one, education has been our administration's top priority. We have provided record funding for education 3 years in a row. And with our upcoming budget, we will do so again for the 4th consecutive year. We are proud to have some of the best schools in America, but unfortunately, far too many deserving children continue to be stuck in schools that are consistently and persistently failing them year after year. Last year, despite the dire warnings of the Maryland State Department of Education and the Maryland State Board of Education, the legislature voted to override my veto of a terrible bill that they called the Protect Our Schools Act. But in reality, it was the Protect Our Failing Schools Act. The misguided bill makes it nearly impossible to fix failing schools. It also prohibits any real improvements to persistently failing schools. It makes it almost impossible to comply with federal law, ESSA, the Every School Succeeds Act, which is a great program that came from the Obama administration's effort to fix failing schools all across America. The actions of the legislature directly threaten Maryland's well-earned reputation as a national leader in education. And the bill that I vetoed, and which they overrode, is unfortunately now state law, despite the very strong objections to nearly anyone that was dealing with facts and reality. As a result, it now has forced Maryland to become the second weakest education accountability system in the United States of America. Maryland is now only allowed to count academic performance as 65%, which does not meet federal accountability standards. Most states have academic performance measures which are counted between 75 and 95%. This reckless law is propelling our schools into a race toward the bottom. Now, this isn't about politics. This is about our children and their future. It's about giving every Maryland child hope and an opportunity for a better future. We simply cannot leave our kids trapped in schools that consistently fail them and cheat them of any real chance, and where they are denied year after year the quality education that they are entitled to. Our Maryland kids deserve better than this. That's why we will be submitting emergency legislation, the Protect Our Students Act of 2018, which will require academic performance to be counted as 80% of a school's composite score, which will take us from the very bottom up to at least the national average of other states. we are continuing our fight to improve Maryland's local schools because the status quo simply is not good enough for Maryland's children. We will also continue our fight for accountability in our local education systems. Parents, students, and teachers are rightfully outraged that our children are being cheated in places like Baltimore County, Howard County, Prince George's County, Washington County, Montgomery County, Baltimore City, and other jurisdictions across the state. And after repeated allegations of wrongdoing, corruption, and exploitation, citizens are losing confidence in the leadership of our local education systems. Last month, a Baltimore County principal pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony theft. There have recently been calls for an investigation and an audit into improprieties by the current Baltimore County school superintendent and the man that she replaced, regarding both of them being paid, and failing to report being paid by the firm that received more than $200 million in contracts for the purchase of digital devices and software. The NAACP and frustrated teachers and parents have repeatedly called for change and for action when it comes to the school leadership or lack of leadership in Prince George's County. The Prince George's County delegation to the House of Delegates unanimously requested that the state investigate widespread allegations of grade fixing, corruption, and the results of the audit that the state did are extremely troubling. And now, people all across the county are calling for the chairman of the school board and the school superintendent in Prince George's County to be fired. More than 5,000 students had their grades changed after the grading cutoff date, and students all across the county who were either ineligible or lacked the proper documentation to graduate, with absence rates of over 40%. Hundreds of students graduated, even though they missed more than 50 days of class. Recent investigative reporting discovered 6 Baltimore City schools where not one single student was proficient in any state testing, and 13 city high schools that did not have one single student who was proficient in math. One school administrator said that 70% of the middle and high schools in the city are changing grades to make the schools appear better on paper. There's been concern and scrutiny in Montgomery County over some school board members who were misusing their government-issued credit cards. There were thousands of dollars in inappropriate meal expenses, which were paid for by Maryland taxpayers. In Washington County, a local school board member was removed after harmful and unprofessional comments on social media. In Howard County, a dozen schools tested for mold, but school officials neglected to inform parents or the school community, and then continued to deny and cover up that problems existed. The problem was so bad at one Howard County school that several students and teachers became ill and required hospitalization. Nearly the entire school board was replaced in the last election, and the school superintendent was fired. In Baltimore County and Baltimore City, officials have continually failed to handle the problems, the repeated air conditioning and heating problems for years in their schools. I want to personally commend Mayor Pugh for taking decisive action this past weekend to try to address the issues in her school system, because with the frigid temperatures that our state is experiencing, we all agree that it is completely unacceptable, particularly when, according to a recent report by the Baltimore Sun, city schools have returned $66 million in state funding for building repairs, much of which was specifically to fix failing HVAC systems, because the projects have been repeatedly prioritized and have been repeatedly funded by the state and then completely mismanaged by the city school system. Unfortunately, there are people who just want to play politics with these issues rather than focusing on our kids. Some who are continually disseminating blatantly false information regarding funding in the schools, particularly in Baltimore City. The state's commitment to and investment in the Baltimore City school system are historic and unprecedented. Facts are stubborn things, but here are the facts. In 3 years, our administration has invested more than $2.85 billion in K-12 education just in Baltimore City. That is more than at any other time in the history of our state. Last year, our state investment into the Baltimore City school system was 3.5 times more than that of the average system in Maryland. In fiscal year 2018, Baltimore City received more than $12,000 per student in financial aid from the state of Maryland. That is nearly double the statewide average for all the other jurisdictions. Baltimore City Schools funding is the 4th highest per pupil funding of all of the 13,500 school systems in America, meaning that there are only 3 systems in the entire country that receive higher school funding than the Baltimore City Schools. For the past 2 years, our state budget has provided funding that goes far above and beyond the formulas which were set in law by the legislature and the previous governor. Just for Baltimore City, in fiscal year 2018, we added nearly $24 million more than the city would have received under the formulas set by the legislature. The city itself, however, has drastically underfunded their schools, while the state has consistently bailed them out. Shockingly, in their last fiscal year, Baltimore City adopted a budget where only 10% of their general fund spending went towards K-12 education. It's outrageous. The statewide average is more than 40%, and some jurisdictions spend over 50 or 60% of their entire local budgets on K-12 education. Baltimore City schools spend more on administrative costs, over $1,600 per student, than any other school system in the United States of America. This is money that never makes it to the classrooms, never makes it to our kids. The decades of underfunding by city leaders has been exacerbated by their woeful mismanagement by the city school board of the state funding that they have been granted. When it comes to the problems in our local school systems, it is not a funding issue. It's an accountability and management and competency issue. We simply cannot allow children to be punished year after year because their adult leaders are failing. This year, our fiscal year 2019 budget, which we will submit next week, will again provide record education funding, including an additional $11 million more than the legislative funding formulas say they should have, just for the Baltimore City schools. And every single school system across the entire state of Maryland will see increased investment by the state in this next budget. However, we are going to require accountability from these school systems. Because of the immediate horrendous failing HVAC systems crisis in Baltimore City, immediately today we are providing an additional $2.5 million in emergency discretionary funding from the state's catastrophic event account to be overseen by the Department of General Services to address the crisis of ensuring that repairs to the heating and air conditioning systems in the Baltimore City schools get done. Let me be clear. This is not to reward the people responsible who have failed. This funding is literally about saving kids from freezing in winter and from sweating and being hospitalized during the warm weather. This is an issue at the Board of Public Works, a bipartisan body, and Comptroller Francho and I have been sounding the alarm bell on for 3 years, trying to force the local school systems to take these problems seriously. Baltimore City's children, Baltimore County's children, in fact, no child in the state of Maryland should ever have to suffer because of the failures of the responsible adult leaders who have repeatedly failed them over and over and over again. There seems to be a persistent and alarming lack of accountability in local education systems all across the state, and it cannot and will not be tolerated by our administration. Not addressing it would mean failing Maryland taxpayers and, more importantly, failing our children, especially the ones who need our help the most. Our state spends more than $6 billion every single year on K through 12 education. We have shattered records on education funding now for 4 years in a row. And with that kind of state taxpayer money invested in the local school systems, taxpayers, parents, teachers, and especially students have a right to expect, and they deserve, more accountability, better local management, and the strongest possible oversight. So we will introduce the Accountability in Education Act of 2018, which will create an Office of the State Education Investigator General. This new education IG will be an independent unit of the Maryland State Department of Education. The new IG will be independently appointed by a commission, which will consist of appointments made jointly by the governor, the president of the Senate, and a Speaker of the House. This new office will be charged with investigating complaints of unethical, improper, illegal conduct on matters including procurement, education assets, graduation requirements, grading, education facilities, and budgets. It will impact individuals employed by the State Department of Education, by any county board of education, any appointed or elected members of a county board of education, and any person or entity associated with the provision of products or services to the State Department of Education, any county board of education, or any school. This new state and education IG will be able to make inquiries and to have the ability to obtain information by subpoena and by holding hearings. The office will also establish an anonymous electronic tip program to protect whistleblowers and to allow Maryland citizens to report potential causes of wrongdoing, abuse, or unethical conduct. Our children desperately need someone to fight for their civil rights, and that is exactly what we intend to continue to do. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions anyone might have.